teacher.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Good to see you all again. And we are continuing this topic of Emunah. And tonight, Shmuel and I, we wanted to talk about belief. We wanted to define Emunah as belief. We spoke in last time I was here. We spoke a bit about how to define it, and the good thing about a word like Emunah is that you can sort of choose yourself how to define it. So tonight I want to define it as belief that. And in English there are two different kinds of beliefs. There is a belief in, and there's a belief that. So, for example, I can say, for example, about my wife, that I have belief in my wife. I have belief in my wife as a Jewish mother, and I have belief in. So there are plenty of things that you can have belief in. I can have belief in God, for example. That would make sense in English. But this is different than belief that. And what's the difference? Well, there's a difference because you can't, for example, say, I have a belief in smoking killing you. That doesn't make any sense suddenly. I have belief in smoking killing you doesn't make any sense. And the reason is because belief in is usually something that we think is positive. So positive things you can have belief in. But then you can have belief that something. And we say in Judaism, for example, very often you might say, I believe that God exists. I sometimes say that I believe that the Jews are a people. So that is a belief that. And tonight I wanted to show a couple of sources about Judaism and the kind of belief that we have. And before I start the first source, first I wanted to just say hi to Rav Shmuel and ask him to if you want to add something to my introduction about belief.
Right, I think it's a very nice starting point, defining Emunah. And yeah, Emunah is it's exactly like we said today. We're going to see there's certain things we believe we believe that they are true, or we should believe, or do we have such things, or don't we have such things? And we'll hear more about it very soon.
Do you have now I'm putting you on the spot here, but do you have an example of something that you believe that?
I suppose we could say I believe that the Torah is true.
Good.
Yeah.
Anyone else because this is better if you add your perspectives and your thoughts, and definitely your questions. And in this shiurim about these difficult topics, we must always remember that the question is always going to be better than the answer. And the more questions we can come up with, the better. But but maybe, do you have any anyone here? Do you have any examples of things that we believe in Judaism? Can you make a sentence with let's say Judaism believes that? And how this works is that if no one volunteers, then you're going to be chosen out by random by me. So that's
Okay,
that might be the price to pay.
Judaism believes that the second temple was destroyed.
Very good. Esther.
Judaism believes that Moshiach Ben David is a human being,
Good.
not Hetzi God and Hetzi human, but totally human being.
Jofi. Florian.
Judaism believes in the coming of the Messianic era.
Good. Very good. Now, when it comes to belief in Judaism, I want to start with this source. First, I would just want to check if Rav Moshe David is still here. Do you have anything you would like to add, Rav Moshe David?
I just have some noise with the kids here, so I don't.
Okay.
I'll get in my input later.
Okay. So I start with a quote from a very provocative book. It's written by a Jewish professor, Menachem Kellner, and he's written a book called "Must a Jew Believe Anything?" So that seems like a title very appropriate for our shiur. And he writes the following: "Must a Jew believe anything? Question mark. If belief is a matter of trust in God, expressed in obedience to the Torah, my answer to the question is that a Jew must believe everything. If belief is the intellectual act, there's quite a circus, Rav Moshe David. Anyone else getting all these beeps and? Oh, okay. So then it's just me. Sorry, it just beeps every time someone's in the waiting room, and when someone logs on, it beeps on my machine. Okay, so maybe it's just by me. If belief is the intellectual acquiescence in carefully defined statements of dogma, meaning this is what belief that is. I believe that Moshiach is a person, as was said. I believe that there's a messianic age at some point. So this is what he talks about with intellectual acquiescence of statements of dogma. The answer is that there is nothing that a Jew must believe. Rav Shmuel, do you have any immediate thoughts on this quote?
Yes, well, I think it's a really good starting point for this discussion, and I think I was just out of interest preparing for the show a bit, looking at Wikipedia a bit about world religions, and many, especially the ones closest to us, the Christians and the Muslims, the idea of what you have to believe and what is the dogma, as is said here, is extremely essential. And in the Torah perspective, this whole idea of dogma, principles of faith, was not discussed for thousands of years. We don't find the Torah doesn't speak about principles of faith. The Talmud doesn't speak about principles of faith.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's a really interesting point. Is there even such a thing as Jewish principles of faith? And the other side of the coin is really you have to believe everything in the Torah. That's like the most basic idea of Judaism, is that the Torah is Hashem's blueprint for the correct life. So you have to believe everything in it. So what's even the point of this whole exercise of talking about principles of faith or central ideas of faith?
Does anyone else want to add something? So you mentioned Rav Shmuel, that we don't really find in the Torah, in the Mishnah, any specific things that a Jew must believe, and the closest thing that Menachem Kellner says in his book, the closest thing that we can come is a Mishnah in Masechet in Sanhedrin. And the Mishnah in Sanhedrin says, Kol Yisrael yesh lahem chelek la'olam haba. That all of the Jewish people, even sinners and those who are liable to be executed with a court-imposed death penalty, have a share in the world to come. Now, so just here, I just like to point out. So here there's a statement about who is in and who is out when it comes to Olam Haba. Olam Haba is what we call the afterlife or the next world. Olam Haba is literally translated as the next world, often viewed or can also be talked about as the afterlife, something that happens after our physical death. Now, so the Mishnah says that some people, some Jews have deserved a right to enter Olam Haba, this next world, and some Jews, unfortunately, don't have a place. Now, what I think is interesting, especially with relation to what we just read, that this sentence really only makes sense as long as we believe that there is an Olam Haba. So without some concept that there is an afterlife, then this first sentence doesn't make any sense. So a lot of the things that we talk about, even though we might not say you have to believe this or you have to believe in that, then there are some assumptions in the background that only make sense as long as we say, yes, this is something that we believe to be true. Now, it then goes on and it says that there are people who have no share in the world to come, even when they fulfilled many mitzvot. One who says there is no resurrection of the dead derived from the Torah. So this is a belief that at some point there is going to be a resurrection of the dead. And one who says that the Torah did not originate from heaven. And the third group of people who don't have a share in the world to come are the apikorsim, or an epikoros. And the Gemara will explain that this word, an apikoros, is someone who treats Torah scholars and the Torah that they teach with contempt. So someone who disrespects the rabbis, they are called an apikoros. And these three groups do not have a share in the world to come. The rest of us are okay. And so this sounds like, Menachem Kellner argues in his book, this Mishnah sounds like some sort of list of things that you have to believe. And if you don't believe it, well, then you're out. But if you look carefully, Menachem Kellner points out that, well, it's not really the Mishnah is not talking about belief. This Mishnah is actually talking about actions and not beliefs, because it's only someone who says that there is no resurrection of the dead that don't have a share in the world to come. And it's only someone who treats Torah scholars with contempt. So it's not, you have a place in Olam Haba if you simply think that all rabbis are clowns. But, if you don't do anything, then it's all good. The problem is when you start disrespecting Torah scholars, well, that's a problem. And it's only if you go around telling people that the Torah is not from God. If you believe that the Torah was written by human beings only 1,000 years ago, then Gesundheit, no problem. You have a share in Olam Haba. But, says the Mishnah, if you go around telling people that it's not from God, well, that's when at least the sources and the Mishnah says, okay, now you've placed yourself outside of the Jewish society, of the Jewish fellowship. And this is a way for the Mishnah to regulate who's in and who's out, which is important for every group. Needs some regulation about what sets yourself, what will set yourself outside of this group. And that's what the Mishnah is doing. But it's not, according to Kellner, and that's why he says what he says so, I think, provocatively, that we don't have any dogmas in Judaism. And that is because he doesn't see this as a list of dogmas. He sees this as a list of actions that will place yourself outside of the Jewish community. Who has
Mm.
a Ramos David?
Yeah, if it's quiet now, I can try to make a comment.
Yeah.
I think there's a bit of a paradox in the very setting saying you must believe in this, right? In the same way that we spoke once about Shema Yisrael, you must love God, right? Or you must love the Gerim, the converts. You must love your neighbor. In this sense, but belief is even stronger than that because love is an emotion, whereas when we talk about into something which is both intellectual, like or you can say the heart and the mind together, then the very definition of it becomes a paradox to say one must do so. So maybe the idea of having emunah in itself is something that I have, not that I believe in or something that you began by that differentiation, but maybe it's something that I have, that I feel, that I'm connected to, that I feel about, rather than the dogma of believing in. So maybe we can make that differentiation as you made now between what is social and may affect others to what I feel myself. And that is my connection to Hashem, which is less defined because it's a connection to the infinite.
Uh-huh. Yeah, good.
Does that make sense?
Yes. I mean, the paradox you're talking about is the problem of legislating belief. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes, and also imagine for someone who comes from outside. It's one thing if you receive something from your parents from a young age, and then it becomes natural for you that this is what I believe in it. This is what we as a people believe. But when you talk about someone who didn't grow up in that sense, then saying we must believe in this or you must believe in this, I think it's one of the most, the Rambam also says, it's one of the most difficult things for a Beit Din in conversion, for example, because it's most important. But how do you actually ask? You can have someone who knows all the right answers about Emunah, but how do you actually know if someone believes? That's where the paradox comes in, because it can't be taught; it has to be believed in. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yes. So in the philosophy of religion, it's often called the ethics of belief, and the question is if it is if it can be a rule, or if it could be legislated that one must believe something. Well, it really depends on the possibility of choosing what you believe. And is it possible to choose what you believe? If it's not possible to choose what you believe, it would be simply cruel to say that someone has to and that there are consequences if you don't. So if you believe that it is a must to believe something, well, then you also must believe that you can choose, in a sense, what you believe. Now, Rambam did believe that. At one in the Mishnah Torah, it says that that one is obligated to believe in that God exists, and in Sefer HaMitzvot, it says that one is obligated to know that God exists. But I do think that it is possible to influence what you believe. If you spend a lot of time together with people who believe that God exists, I think there's a high chance you're going to come to believe that God exists. If you spend a lot of time together with people who are good at giving tzedakah, I think you're going to become better at giving tzedakah as well. So I think there is a way to at least influence what you believe. If we can completely control it, I'm not so sure. But I do think that you can have a responsibility to try and give yourself the best possible chance to believe something, at least.
Some people sometimes you also encounter there's the bit of another paradox is like between understanding and believing, because all these things in the Mishnah are quite difficult concepts even to understand. Olam Haba is never clearly defined anywhere in the Talmud what exactly it is. Resurrection of the dead, these are like extremely difficult concept which we don't even understand what they are. The Talmud never explains exactly what they are, and it was huge, we don't even have that much text in our Jewish tradition discussing this. So it's interesting. Does believing necessarily mean understanding, or is believing just I accept this is as a fact without actually understanding what it is? That's, I think, also something that's quite interesting in this whole Mishnah.
Yeah, well, so let's, yes, Yeta.
Just a minute. Yeah. This paradox, for sure, you are not agree with everything in the Judaism. You're not agree with every Jews, French Jews. So you have thinner line in different sections of what you read, how you keep this Judaism. So I don't know, the paradox, it's a very hard word in a way. Yeah. So I don't understand quite well the paradox. I don't know the word is right in my head.
Right.
Please say something.
Yeah. Would you like to try again, Rav Moshe David, explaining what the paradox is? Okay. I'm not so sure what the paradox is. I think there is a paradox. I'm not sure if Rav Moshe David, if it was a difficulty, but there is a paradox when it comes to what we should believe. And I don't know if we touched upon this last time, but there is a paradox there that is noted by there's a paradox in Rambam's understanding that you have to believe that God exists, and there is Rambam believes that there's an obligation to believe that God exists. There's an obligation to believe that God exists. And Chasdai Kreskas, a couple of hundred years later, he understands that there is a paradox, because he says, if you already believe that there's an obligation from God, well, why does it have to be obligated? You already believe. And if you don't believe that there's a God that obligates, well, then you're sort of stuck. So Kreskas does think that there's a paradox if you say that there's an obligation from God that you believe that God exists, because then you probably already believe that God exists. What's the purpose? Why do you need to obligate it? And if you don't believe that God exists, well, then how could there ever be an obligation to believe in him? So in that sense, people feel that Rambam is sort of stuck in a catch-22, which is a paradox.
I would add that I think the catch-22 is beautiful, because the only solution for that is Emunah. In other words, if we get into an intellectual catch itself, it means our heart is not open. If the whole idea is that we open our hearts to Hashem and that we connect to Hashem, then all of that becomes irrelevant. Of what we have. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. In other words, the definitions themselves, even the Rambam's definitions, right, of the principles become, I mean, it's a list, but at the end of the day, it's almost, you could say it's a training of what I'm trying to train myself to believe in. But there's always I would say there's a gap between the intellectual and the heart. And believing in Hashem is believing in the infinite, believing in something much larger, perhaps, than the definitions themselves of how I I guess the question is, am I actually painting myself a picture of what my emunah is? Am I painting a definition of what my belief is? Or am I sort of saying these are the guidelines, but my emunah is much deeper than that?
Okay. This was very deep, but maybe Cecilia.
I think just I see the confusion, but I think what I'm trying to get is that at the end of the day, we see other religions which are very dogmatic, and we see the dangers of extremism following what is called fundamentalism, following this is what we believe in, and there's no flexibility, and there's no individualism, and there's no personal connection. This is what it is, and this is what I follow. And I think in the sources, even the provocative source that you shared, but also in the Rambam, the whole spectrum of Emunah is allowing a lot of freedom for exploration, for us to find, to feel, to connect, either emotionally or intellectually, or both.
Yeah, this I agree with. There's a lot of freedom within the different beliefs. There are different things available in Judaism, and it is not so often that Judaism says you have to believe this and everything else is treif. So sometimes I think it's much more valuable. Instead of asking what do we have to believe, sometimes it's a lot more valuable to ask what is not permitted to believe. So Judaism often has answers, or sometimes has answers to the question, a clear answer to the question, what's not permitted to believe. What we have to believe is also can be a range of different possibilities. But sometimes there is that there is no olam haba, for example, I haven't seen in our tradition. But exactly to define what is olam haba, so you have a good few options that are all kosher. So that could be a way to reach some conclusions that are a lot easier than asking positively what is something. But okay, Cecilia.
Oh, yes. Now you can hear me. I'm thinking of, you're saying to believe that has to be a sense, feeling, a change, some kind of feeling. So when God exists, you can use it in your thinking mind, or you can feel it. It's quite different, emunah. And when you tell yourself, I believe that God exists, but to feel it and to have the sensation of it, when you see the world and you see the creation, that gives you a more sensation. And this is quite a different speak of when you're talking about the Jews or a people that you know by your knowledge, your intellectual way. The other way is more sensation. For me, this emunah is quite different.
Okay. Right. And like I said, the beauty of the word emunah is that one can choose what definition one would like. But the word emunah also has the meaning of belief that. But I do think that it's important to what you're saying. It's important to note that there are different ways of coming to a belief that. And an experience or a sensation, as you called it, can also be a way of understanding something, understanding the world around us, and come to a belief that. It doesn't always have to come from what we think is pure reasoning. So one of the most important arguments for the existence of God comes from a religious experience, and that is absolutely legitimate. That is one way of coming to understand how the world works and how the world is put together. So I do believe that that's also important, and it doesn't have to exclude the sensations. Do not exclude or is in a different place than what we're talking about. I think that's absolutely relevant. Okay, let's see another source. Now, Shmuel mentioned that, well, we don't really have anything specific about what the Olam Haba is. So here's a source. Rambam has some ideas, at least, about what the Olam Haba is like. And he says, one should not presume that the Messianic king must work miracles and wonders, bring about a new phenomena in the world, resurrect the dead, or perform other similar deeds. This is definitely not true. Proof can be brought from the fact that Rabbi Akiva, one of the greater sages of the Mishnah, was one of the supporters of King Bar Koziba, and would describe him as the Messianic king. He and all the sages of his generation considered him to be the Messianic king until he was killed because of his sins. So this is a story about Bar Kokhba, who led a rebellion against the Rome and the Romans, and in 134 after year 0. And once he was killed, they realized that he was not the Mashiach. Probably a majority of the Jewish people believed that he was the Mashiach. Now, what's important is that he says, the Rambam says that the Olam Haba is going to be exactly like this world. There's not going to be an uprooting of nature, and the laws of nature are going to continue. There's not going to be a resurrection of the dead, and there's not going to be new phenomena in the world. So, according to Rambam, the Olam Haba, at least the Messianic world, is not talking about the Olam Haba, but he's talking about the Messianic world, sorry. And the Messianic world is going to, after Mashiach comes, is going to look very much like the one that we know. And when it comes to the Olam Haba, he says that in the Olam Haba, in the world to come, there is no body or physical form. Ha'olam haba ein bo guf u'gviya, אלא נפשות הצדיקים בלבד, בלא גוף כמלאכי השרת. Only the souls of the righteous without a body, like the ministering angels. So here we have two beliefs, clear beliefs that. One is that the Messianic world, after the Mashiach has been here, after we've identified the Mashiach, then, you know what? Things are going to stay very much the same. And Rambam says, even for thousands of years, this can stay the same, he says. That's what he believes. And the beauty, according to Rambam, is that well, when the Mashiach comes, things will be stable. There will be political stability. And when we have political stability, we can start focusing and working on the things that matters about ourselves. So we will have more time dedicated to the important things. And when it comes to the Olam Haba, it's clear that he believes that there is a spiritual world. It's not a physical world. It's a spiritual world. Now, the last thing I want to say before I think I'll give Shmuel a chance. Rambam had an idea that he believed that. Let's talk about with the expressions that we've been using. Rambam believed that there was something that would survive our physical deaths, and that was our knowledge. Our knowledge of God would survive our physical death. That's what we bring into the Olam Haba. And the more knowledge you have of God, the more fun you're going to have in the Olam Haba. And that was what he believed. He had a different concept. He had a different conception of knowledge than I think most of us have today. But at least I think it was a clear belief about what's going to happen in the afterlife. Now, one doesn't have to believe that exactly this. You don't have to believe exactly what Rambam did. And there are other things, there are other possibilities as well. You have a very different one, which is really sort of opposite, where the most important thing that we do is mitzvot. That's, according to us, that's the most important thing we can do. So some Jewish thinkers they say it would be very strange if the Olam Haba, the spiritual, this world in the afterlife, isn't going to be about mitzvot. That would be very strange. But in Rambam's afterlife, there are no mitzvot. There's no body to do any mitzvah. So some people believe that the Olam Haba is a world where we have our bodies. it's a world after the resurrection, and we will have the possibility to serve God, because that's the most important thing. So there are different possibilities, but again, I think it is sometimes instructive to ask the question slightly differently, which is, what does Judaism not believe? But with that, I'm gonna ask Rav Shmuel to add some thoughts.
Thank you very much, Michael. It was very, very interesting, and especially I like this last addition you said about the mitzvot. That I never thought about that way. I was familiar with from my studies of this machloket, this argument, the Rambam school of thought and understanding of the world to come, and that of the other Rishonim, the other medieval commentators. I never really thought about it from the perspective of the mitzvot, that the mitzvot are important, and how could the final reward be a world without mitzvot, which is purely spiritual. Anyways.
Would you like a source? Do you want to see the source?
Yeah, you can.
So Ravad. So Ravad was Rambam's. So just the introduction to Ravad. Rambam had many critics, but probably no one greater than someone named Ravad. Rambam had a lot of critics because he decided to write down all the conclusions of the Talmud without any of the discussions. And Rambam thought, I think, highly of himself with good reason, but he didn't think that it was necessary to write down any of the references. So he just wrote down He wrote down the Mishnah Torah with all the conclusions, and he didn't feel like it was necessary to write down where he got all these answers. And this, of course, made a lot of people very angry. And Ravad was particularly, I think, annoyed, and he went through all of the Mishnah Torah and he wrote comments wherever he thought Rambam was wrong. And this was in a lot of places. So one of the comments that he writes is exactly about Rambam's belief about the Olam Haba. And Ravad comments and he says, the world to come harbors neither body nor concrete form. This is what Rambam believed. This is what he wrote. And Ravad's comment is, this man's words are in my eyes nigh, meaning it's nothing, to such who assert that there is no resurrection to body but the souls alone. But by the life of my head, this was not the opinion of our sages. May their memory be blessed. Behold, they have said the righteous are prepared to rise up in their garments, deduct major from minor by comparison of grain and wheat. And he says, all of which is conclusive proof that the dead will arise with their bodies and remain alive. Nevertheless, it is possible that the Creator will set them in strong, healthy forms. It's the force of the angels, right? So here, this is the other opinion, or at least another opinion, by Ravad, which was not Rambam's greatest fan. Yeah.
Yes, very interesting. So I want to say on to do a little bit of a study on the Rambam and his principles, but maybe just a little bit of introduction before we delve into them, because as we said already at the beginning, and as we were just told and explained, there isn't really an organic or internal system of principles in the Torah or in the Tanakh or really even in the Talmud, besides just these fragments of Mishnah, which do say specific statements, specific people not being allowed in the world to come. There isn't really a clear system of essential beliefs. And actually, it would be a bit funny if we did have such essential beliefs, because the essence, because you're meant to believe in what it says in the Torah, right? And I mean, the essential idea is to keep the Torah, to keep the mitzvot. And the idea of singling something out is almost like saying this is more important, this is essential, and the rest of the Torah is not essential. As we will soon see, that's the opposite. of the Torah. Yeah, it's actually quite interesting. Talmud relates a story that there were certain groups, certain heretical groups in the times of Talmud who tried to separate from Judaism. And they were saying, just keep the Ten Commandments. That's what's important. Some people say these were the first Christians, actually, because that's what the Christians eventually did. They removed the ritual laws like circumcision and kashrut and only practiced the beliefs or the so-called ethical laws. But it's actually very interesting. The Talmud tells us that it used to be the custom every day as part of the tefillah, as part of the Shema, actually, to also read the Ten Commandments. And the rabbis removed this custom. Why? Not to allow anybody to think that there was some basis for what this movement, this early heretical movement was saying, that only the Ten Commandments matter, the rest doesn't matter. So the rabbis, Talmud, actually were purposely trying to run away from, so to say, shortened versions or like, how would I say, slogans of Judaism, because those are very dangerous because they make you think this is important and this is not important. I remember there was, maybe you heard about the Shabbat initiative. There was like this initiative in Shabbat UK, Shabbat South Africa, Shabbat France, Shabbat World. Just take one Shabbat and call as many people as you can and tell them keep Shabbat. People who don't keep Shabbat usually keep Shabbat for once. And and what somebody once told me, he doesn't like it so much because this one Shabbat out of 54 Shabbatot a year you respect and are like putting so much emphasis on it, it's like denigrating the other 53. Okay, so I don't know. I think it was, anyway, a very nice initiative to encourage people to keep Shabbat, especially if they don't keep Shabbat. If they can do it even once, it's an amazing thing. But it's always a danger whenever you take principles and say, this is really, really important. At the same time, the message you're bringing is something else is not as important. But the Rambam felt it was necessary to create a system of principles, and he numbered them as the 13 Yesodot or 13 Ikarim. You should know the words here don't matter so much because he didn't write it in Hebrew, he wrote it in Arabic. It's in this very Mishnah that Michael just showed to you. On that, the Rambam wrote a commentary, and in that commentary, he has a lot to say on many things. He talks about what is Olam Haba and what happens there, and what is reward and punishment and the resurrection of the dead, and he has a lot to say. And then he said, oh, I'm not going to tell you what are the 13 main ideas of Judaism. Now, I would have loved to go through the text of the Rambam itself, because it's very interesting, but our time is very limited, and I knew it was going to be limited. So instead, I chose something which will hopefully be quite familiar to many of you, which is the which is the song of Yigdal. If many of you might have, might know this song. You can find it in most Sidurim, in most prayer books, either at the beginning of the day. Some people had a custom. I don't know if it's very common nowadays, but there were people who would sing this song every day at the beginning of their day. And where more commonly you find it at the end of the Friday night prayers. And in many, many communities, definitely we do it here in Helsinki. Probably, I don't know what the custom is in other Nordic countries, but it's a common thing to sing Friday night. And it's basically the 13 principles of the Rambam put in verses. Yeah. So I thought it'd be a nice exercise to go through it. And this way, when you sing it next time, maybe you'll have a little bit more of an understanding of what are you actually singing. I also thought, just one last thing important before we go into actual principles, the Rambam felt the need for this principle very much because of the historic and political context of the time. He lived very much in the Muslim world. He lived in Spain, which was Muslim controlled, then in Eretz Israel, then in Egypt most of his life. And of course, he heard a lot about Christianity as well. This was a time of big religious, theological debate.
Aristotelian philosophy, of course, plays a very important role as well. And he's trying to define, well, what is Judaism? Because you see it in his style of halakha as well, as you mentioned, the Mishneh Torah, these books of clearly defining the halakha and the law. So here he's trying to clearly define what is Jewish belief. And you will notice in a lot of these principles are sort of like excluding the other religious beliefs that were common in that time and are still common today. So it's almost like a bit like you were saying, what Judaism is not is also perhaps an underlying theme in these very principles. So let's look at the first one. We sing Yigdal Elohim Chai V'Yishtabach, exalted is the living God, and praise he exists, and his existence transcends time. En et el mitzvto. Bit poetic language, et is time. There is no time for his existence. The idea that God exists, very simple, basic belief, is not connected to time. That's something the Rambam speaks a lot about. The idea that God is beyond everything, time, space. He's created all of these things. The Rambam has something very interesting to say on the Torah. When we read a few weeks ago, we have this famous conversation of God and Moses in the burning bush. And Moses asks, well, the Jews will ask me, who is it? What's his name? What's the name of this God who sent you? And then God answers, I am who I am, or I shall be who I shall be. And it's a lot of this kind of what exactly does this answer mean? And the Rambam's understanding is that the answer means that I am the only real existence, because everything else only exists because God wants it to exist at this moment. They're like, so to say, possible things that can exist or they cannot exist. But God is the primary and first and original and only true existence. That's sort of like the idea here. Then, Echad ve'en yachid keyochudo. He is one and there is no unity like his. Ne'elam ve'gam en sof la'ahavato. He's invisible, his unity is infinite. Now, very interesting. Ve'en yachid keyichudo. There is no oneness like his oneness, no unity like his. And this is really important because saying that somebody is one can mean a lot of different things. You could say you believe that there is only one God. That's what we believe. You can believe that there is one table in the room, or there is one chair in the room, or one can mean a lot of things. But when we speak about God being one, it means there is no division, separation, different strengths, different powers. As in a human being would have different muscles, different physical body parts. There's no division in God. God is absolutely one, right? Why is this such an essential and important thing? This all goes into the philosophy, understanding that God is purely spiritual. And that's what really leads us to the next principle. He's not a body. He doesn't have the form of a body. He's not a body. So again, the idea is, and the Rambam speaks a lot about this because it's not an obvious thing at all. You know, if you look at the Tanakh, and it's full, or the Talmud is full of representations of God. We say it, all of us, we know very well what we say on the Leila Seder, on Pesach. God took us out with a mighty hand, with an outstretched arm and a mighty hand from the land of Egypt. We talk about God's nose, Pharaoh, his anger flaring up in his nose. We keep his ear, he turns his ear. We keep talking the whole time as if God had body parts. And the Rambam, in many, many places, says very strongly, these are not real. They don't mean that God has any sort of body. They are just expressions. They're just metaphors to explain a concept. And this is something that's very essential in the Rambam philosophy. And it's already the same thing. There's only one, and therefore there can't be a body. If there was a body, there would be many parts. And they cannot be a body because bodies are physical. They are part of this world. They are born, they live, they die. Because God doesn't have death either, doesn't have any, because God created life. He's completely above all of these laws of nature. God created the laws of physics, the laws of nature. So the idea that God is beyond and is not limited by any of these things is very important. Lo naroch elav kedushato. His holiness is beyond comparison. It means we don't compare him to anything. I think it was very good what you were saying here. Michal was saying, and you're all saying that it's much easier to say what is not. And the Rambam always speaks about what God is not, rather than about what God is. Because once you start talking about what he is, you're actually limiting him. You're not saying that God is good, or he's loving, or he's caring. These are all concepts that he has created, and he's beyond them. So this is sort of, this is an important point here, that we're not comparing it to anything really in this world. Okay, then we have, he's the first thing in the world. There's nothing before him. There's never been anything before, like, quite clear. The fifth principle is actually interesting. So if you read the Rambam himself, he defines the fifth principle as being service must be only to God. You should only worship God, not any other power in this world. And it's actually very interesting, because on the first note, it doesn't really sound like a principle at all. Everything we've said so far, from 1 to 4, was all about what we believe God is, or what is an essential belief. This sounds more like a law. It's the second commandment of the 10 Commandments, right? You're not allowed to serve any other god. It's more law than a belief. But I think here it's important to understand again the context of the time. The Christians, of course, also believed in one God, or they claim to believe in one God, but they also believe that praying to Jesus, praying to Mary, or praying to the saints, especially in Catholicism, these can also give you something. And the Rambam very strongly rejects it. This is not part of Judaism. You cannot pray to any power to be like a go-between between you and God. You can't pray to an angel. You can't pray to the sun or to the moon, even if you believe that originally, on top of all of this, there is one God. So it's quite interesting that this, which is really a law prohibiting idolatry, is also an essential belief, because even the moment you accept there is an intermediary between you and God, there's something wrong in your belief. You're not really believing that God is everywhere. There is no other power which can grant you any request in any way. But so this is a very interesting point. And then he goes to prophecy. The fullness of his prophecy he bestowed on those who he treasured and in whom he gloried. Okay, so certain people can be prophets, Nevi'im. Again, the idea of prophecy here is interesting. It's very essential as a belief, because the idea of the Torah is, and the Tanakh is very much about prophecy. God gave messages to the Jewish people. I wanted to say one thing I forgot, important about the previous, just an interesting note. If you look at this sentence, only worship God. If you look at the text, as it's written in Hebrew, it actually says, Ino Adon Olam Lechol Notar. He is the master of all creation. Yoreh Gedulato Umalchuto. Like proclaim, or this proclaims his greatness or his majesty. it doesn't actually speak clearly about prayer. Yeah, and Yoreh is more like it shows. This shows his greatness and his majesty. So it's not really talking about praying at all. Somebody once showed me, interesting, that in some older versions of Yigdal, there was no lamed here. It was written, Hino Adon Olam, comma, he is the master of the universe. Kol notzar yodeh. Instead of a resh, there was a dalet. You see, the resh and dalet are very similar. So it was a square here, dalet. Kol notzar yodeh gedulato malchuto. Every living being thanks him and accepts his greatness and his kingship. So it's an interesting point. But it could be that the comma chain, the lamed chain, that is like some little scribal mistake, which happened, of course. This song is from the Middle Ages. There was no printing press. This was all handwritten. So it could be that it sort of got confused. And today we're left with a sentence that doesn't really seem to have anything to do with the principle. We're just saying God is great. He's the master of the universe. And this shows that he's great and he has and this is kingship. But the main point here was really to talk about praying, not to pray to any other power than God. Okay, anyways, we're talking about prophecy. Prophecy, of course, is very essential because that's the belief that God is not gone further. He hasn't pushed himself further away from this world and has nothing to do with the world, but actually communicates with people in this world. Also mentions who can be a prophet. Those he treasured and in whom he gloried. Not everyone can be a prophet. Again, this is part of the Rambam's philosophy. Speaks a lot about the Nevi'im, the prophets. Prophets are people who prepare themselves for the prophecy. They are very, very righteous people, very learned people, very, very pure people. You can't just, God doesn't just speak suddenly to you. So this is again in the same vein. Again, interesting. The Rambam, of course, at his time was very common. This Aristotelian philosophy and these ideas that there might be a power somewhere, but he doesn't have anything to do with this world. He's very strong that no, the Torah, Judaism is different. Judaism believes God is active in this world. Lokam beIsrael ke Moshe od. Moses was the greatest of all prophets. Navi mabitet emunato. There was never a prophet like Moses. A prophet beheld God's image. This again is interesting because really you would think this is just a very small detail. So lots of prophets, and the greatest of them was Moses. So why is this a principle? It's a detail amongst the many details in the Torah. But again, important here to remember the context. The Muslims, the Christians claim that somebody greater came later, and he changed the Torah. The Muslims also claim there was a greater prophet later. Here he's saying no. Judaism accepts there can never be somebody greater than Moshe. It's written in the Torah. There never was a prophet as great as Moshe ever. So the Torah cannot, and this is what leads to the next one, obviously. Torah temet atan lanu. Everything in Torah is absolutely true. Alei nevio neiman beto, through the prophet, trust of his house, Moshe, and lo yachlif ve'er v'lo yamir dato. He will never change the Torah forever. It's very interesting. If you ever, we just don't have the time, but if you read the Rambam's text inside, very interesting. He says there a line which I always thought is so powerful. He says, there is no difference between the sentence, I am Hashem your God, and the sentence, the sister of Lotan was called Timnah. In the Torah, there's a lot of sentences, lots of text and lots of things, and there is moments that feel like wow, like amazing, like Hashem your God, Shema Israel. And there are small details like now, last week, the last 2 weeks, or the Mishkan has to be this size and this size and so many cubits and this. And he says there's no difference. Everything in the Torah is essential and must be super, super important because otherwise God wouldn't have put it in the Torah. So I think this is quite a very basic, it's quite a unique way to look at the Torah. Because the Bible today is universal heritage. The Christians know the Bible, the world knows the Bible. But this idea to dissect and to look at the deeper meaning of every letter is very essential to Judaism. And this is something the Rambam actually puts here as a principle. Okay, we're running out of time. I'm just going to say, next one, he knows the secrets in our heart. God is all-knowing. Reward and punishment. He gives person according to his deeds. He gives the bad person according to his wickedness. I think this is also very beautiful because it's not just he punishes the wicked and he rewards the good. It's according to the deeds you get reward, and according to the wickedness you get punishment. So it's always midah keneged midah, is exactly in measure of what the person never gets a worse punishment than what they deserve, never a bigger reward than what they sending of Mashiach, we already talked a lot about that. I don't want to go more into that, but you see, it's a principle. It's something that's mentioned in the Torah, that we will come back to a land, there will be a complete redemption. And then there is the Tchiyat HaMetim, as we saw very clearly in Mishnah, is something every Jew has to believe in. And even though, or at least this is a very essential idea in our faith, even though it's the question, what does it actually mean that the dead will come back to life? And does it mean in the times of Mashiach, is it in eternal life, is it spiritual, physical, this world, that world? That's already a lot of commentary, a lot of discussion. And to finish up with exactly what Amira was saying, it is very, these principles are very useful to tell us what not to believe in, but they still leave a lot of room for us to think what to believe. And thank you.
Well done. Does anyone have a question or a comment to what Rav Shmuel shared? Yeah, Esther.
So if there is a reward and punishment, and we believe that there is Olam Haba, is there also Gehinnom and different levels of Gehinnom? And what is really Gehinnom?
Okay, that's a really good question. So the idea of reward and punishment comes a lot in our sources. In the Torah, reward and punishment always seems to be talking about this world, you know. We say every day, second paragraph of Shema. If you really listen to God, there'll be rain, there'll be blessing, there'll be everything. And if not, we'll be sent out of our land. But of course, that cannot be the final answer to everything, because there are very good people here who are suffering, and there are very bad people who are seem to be having at least a good life. So there must be something else, something higher. It's a higher purpose to everything. So we are told a lot, they talk about in the Talmud, different types of spiritual levels. There's the idea of life after death. And there's the idea that one day the dead will come back to life. And there's the idea of Olam Haba, which is a future world, which is a different type of world, whatever that means. So the idea of Gehinnom is mentioned in the Talmud, and it seems to be some sort of short-term place where a person can end up in after their death, if they're not yet ready to enter Gan Eden, to enter the Garden of Eden, the place of reward. And that's actually where the custom of the Kaddish comes from. You have this custom to say Kaddish 11 months for somebody who's passed away. Why? Because the very, very bad people, they have to spend 12 months in Gehenna. But nobody hopes their mother or father was so evil. So just say it for 11 months, and someone that protects them, helps them to get out of Gehenna. That's the Kabbalistic idea of saying Kaddish for 11 months. But what do these things actually mean? That's very, very hard for us to know. Obviously, they cannot be physical places in the sense of we think, because the body decays. So what exactly does it mean that the soul is punished? That's something that's quite open to interpretation. One idea that I've often heard is that so to say, the soul being as close to God as possible is the best reward, and Gehinnom is somehow preventing that. But this is in the Torah, we much more concentrate on our actions in this world, because the actions in this world are the only thing that can actually affect what's going to happen afterwards. And that's why we don't spend so much time and effort in our sources to speculate on what's going to happen afterwards.
I'll just add a different perspective, because that's what happens when we start talking about belief. And since we've been talking a lot about Rambam, I'll add what I believe Rambam to be saying about reward and punishment, and it's connected to, and it's a complicated. The question is very good, and Rambam thinks it's so good that he writes something slightly different in other places. Now Rambam is known by two names: Rambam, that's his Jewish name, and Maimonides, which is his Greek name. And there is a funny saying that Maimonides would not get into Rambam's heaven. So they were the same person, but they do seem to say quite different things sometimes. And in Perek Chelek, in his commentary to the Mishnah, so Rambam talks about reward and punishment, and he really rephrases. I think we would use the terms the way he describes it as results and consequences. When we say reward and punishment, at least my connotation is that God directly responds to something that we do, either good and bad, and he rewards when we do good and he punishes when we do bad. Now, Maimonides seem to believe that God doesn't need to do that, because he's created a world where there are consequences and results. There are positive results for good actions, for mitzvot, and there are bad results if you choose to do bad. Now, there's no need for God to directly give out reward and punishments, and I think in terms of Gehenna, the specific question about Gehenna, I think Rambam believes that there is everyone ends up in this spiritual world, and the aim of the spiritual world is to enjoy God's radiance and God's presence. And if you don't know enough about God, if you don't have the awareness of God, then it's not going to be such a fun place. So if you call it Gehenna or not, I'm not so sure if it makes much of a difference if it has a name. It's not going to be a fun place, according to Rambam. And it is only if you show up on Wednesday evenings to learn about Emunah, then I think we have a good shot, according to Rambam. I think we're in a good place.
Oh,
Yeah, Yeta.
oh yeah. Thank you so much, both of you, for this Rambam. Very, very shorted 13 principles and in a short time. Thank you very much. It was
Pleasure.
fun in a way.
Thank you, guys. Does anyone have any last questions? Okay. Thank you very much for coming and learning with us.
Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure.
תודה
Thank
רבה.
you, everyone.
שבוע טוב, סוף שבוע טוב.
All טוב. Hi, Thomas.
תודה רבה רב.
All the best.
תודה רבה רב.
ביי, יריל. כל טוב. רב שמואל, תודה רבה. ביי ביי.
Thank you. Bye.